These are more than 40% of American retirees who didn't actually choose to retire, pushed out by a layoff, sidelined by their own health, pulled away by a family crisis, or quietly nudged out the door by a company that decided they'd been around too long. If you are somewhere between 45 and 65 right now, watching this with a 401k balance, a pension, or a retirement date circled on your calendar, stick with me through the whole video. The numbers on what is actually happening to older American workers are uglier than most people realize. And the gap between what people plan for and what actually happens to them is genuinely shocking. Here is where that headline figure comes from. Back in July of 2023, Edward Jones, one of the largest financial services firms in the country, surveyed financial advisors across the industry. And 40% of those advisors reported that their retiree clients did not retire on their own terms. They were forced into it. Once you start pulling on that thread, every other major retirement study tells the same story from a different angle. EBRI, the Employee Benefit Research Institute, runs the longest running retirement survey in America. And their 2026 retirement confidence survey found that 46% of retirees left the workforce earlier than they planned, with only 6% retiring later than expected. Their 2024 spending in retirement survey pushed the number even higher, landing at 58%. Allianz Life ran their own version of this in January of 2026 and published it in May, finding that 42% of retired Americans walked away from work earlier than they planned. The Society of Actuaries Research Institute surveyed over 1,000 retirees in 2024 and came back with the bleakest result of all. 59% of retirees stopped working before they expected to. Pick whichever study you trust. And the number lands somewhere between 40% and 60%. That isn't a rounding error. That is the majority of American retirees never getting the retirement timeline they actually planned for. Here is where it gets uncomfortable, because the honest question is, what is driving all of this? The Allianz study broke it down clearly. Health issues that prevented people from doing their job took the top spot at 30%. Unexpected job loss came in at 21%, and being financially ready earlier than expected also landed at 21%. The disconnect appeared the moment Allianz asked workers who hadn't retired yet why they thought they might retire early. Those still working Americans gave completely different answers, talking about spending more time with family or reducing stress. Almost nobody predicted a layoff or a health collapse. And yet those are the things that actually happen. The Society of Actuaries sliced the same data by income. And that is where the picture gets really stark for retirees earning under $35,000 a year. The top reason for retiring early was a change in health status, followed by job loss in second place. And both of those reasons sit completely outside the worker's control. For retirees pulling in more than $75,000 a year, the leading reason was job dissatisfaction, with hitting a savings goal early coming in second. And both of those reasons fall squarely within the worker's control. Craig Copeland, who runs wealth benefits research at EBRI, put it bluntly in USA Today, telling them, quote, "The higher income people are more likely to do it because it is their choice, whereas the lower income people are more likely to have their health or a change at the company being the cause, end quote. He added that for those lower earners, it is out of their control when we talk about 40% or more of Americans being forced to retire. What we're really describing is a problem concentrated among the people with the smallest cushion to absorb the hit. Now, I want to spend a minute on the part of this story almost nobody covers, because it isn't just health and it isn't just layoffs in some vague sense. Something more deliberate has been going on. Back in 2018, ProPublica teamed up with the Urban Institute and dug into the health and retirement study, the gold standard dataset funded by the National Institutes of Health and the Social Security Administration. Their team tracked workers who entered their 50s holding stable, full-time jobs. They kept for at least 5 years, which is the safest possible position an older worker can be in. The result was brutal. 56% of those workers either got laid off at least once or were pushed out under conditions that made it clear they didn't take leave voluntarily. Outright layoffs accounted for 28%. Another 13% suddenly retired under conditions suggesting they were forced out, and a further 15% quit after their hours pay or treatment by supervisors visibly deteriorated. Layer on workers who left because of poor health or family caregiving, and the share of older Americans pushed out of regular work climbs to nearly 2/3. Recovery from that hit is rare, with only 1 in 10 displaced workers ever earning as much as they did before. Richard Johnson, the Urban Institute economist who worked on the analysis, told ProPublica, quote, "For the majority of older Americans, working after 50 is considerably riskier and more turbulent than we previously thought," end quote. One line from Gary Burtless, a Labour economist at the Brookings Institution, has stuck with me. His words to ProPublica were, quote, "We've known that some workers get a nudge from their employers to exit the workforce, and some get a great big kick. What these results suggest is that a whole lot more are getting the great big kick," end quote. Remember, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, ADIA, has been on the books since 1967, and Congress effectively banned mandatory retirement back in 1986. Federal courts, however, have steadily narrowed those protections over the last 2 decades. ProPublica reported separately in 2018 that IBM had pushed out more than 20,000 US workers age 40 and over in just 5 years, with one internal company document using the phrase, quote, "correct seniority mix," end quote, to describe the goal. IBM responded by stating that the company complies with all applicable laws. The legal protection exists on paper. The reality on the ground looks like something else entirely. Let's talk about what an early exit actually costs you if you end up on the wrong side of these numbers. The average American worker expects to retire at 65, but the actual average retirement age in this country is 62. And that 3-year gap is a much bigger deal than it sounds. Catherine Collinson, CEO of the Transamerica Center for Retirement Studies, laid it out on CNBC, explaining that stopping at 62 instead of 67 erases 5 years of income, 5 years of employer-sponsored benefits, 5 years of extra social security credits, and 5 years of compound growth on your investments. On top of all of that, you are stuck paying for your own health insurance until Medicare finally kicks in at 65, which is punishing financially. Her exact words, quote, many people may not even realize how severe the consequences can be and how absolutely critical those extra 5 or 10 years in the workforce can be in terms of achieving retirement security. End quote. The Social Security math hits even harder. According to EBRI, the median age Americans start claiming Social Security is 64, while full retirement age sits at 66 or 67, depending on when you were born. Claiming early permanently reduces your benefit, while waiting until 70 produces a dramatically larger check. Most Americans never get to make that choice because life makes it for them. Then there is the savings problem, which is its own quiet disaster. The Federal Reserve's most recent survey of consumer finances from 2022 shows that the typical American family in the 65 to negative 74 range with a retirement account has roughly $200,000 saved. The detail almost nobody mentions is that only about half of households in that age group have a retirement account at all, which means a huge slice of older Americans are walking into retirement, often involuntarily, with no dedicated retirement savings and leaning entirely on Social Security. Here is the strange wrinkle in all of this. Despite everything I just laid out, most retirees report that they're doing okay. The Federal Reserve found that 81% of retirees said they were at least okay financially. The Society of Actuaries found that only 19% described themselves as worse off than expected. And EBRI found that just 24% rated their standard of living as fair or poor. What that really tells us is that people adapt, they downsize, they cut back, and they rebuild their expectations. Edward Jones found that 48% of advisors recommend their forced retirement clients adopt a more frugal lifestyle. And Craig Copeland from EBRI summed it up by saying, there is a great deal of making adjustments and learning to live with what you have. Making it work, though, is not the same as the retirement you actually planned for. So what is the takeaway here, especially if you are sitting somewhere in that 45 to negative 65 window watching this? First, the Allianz study found that 80% of Americans believe working longer would help them financially. Yet 35% of them also admitted they'd likely just retire if they lost their job within the next 6 months. Among baby boomers, specifically, that number jumps to 58%. The strategy of just working longer is the strategy most likely to collapse the moment real life intervenes. Second, the Edward Jones survey found that 52% of advisors recommend supplemental health insurance for clients heading into retirement, with 48% recommending long-term care insurance, because health is the single most common reason people get forced out. The Federal Reserve found that 29% of retirees pointed to a health problem as a factor in their decision to retire, while 15% retired specifically to care for a family member. Third, this isn't a fringe problem and it isn't getting better. ProPublica, its analysis showed that the share of older workers facing employer-driven separations climbed from just over 10% in 1998 to nearly 30% by 2016. The percentage of recent retirees who described their retirement as forced or partially forced rose from 33% in 1998 to 55% by 2014. Every long-term trend points in the wrong direction. When a headline says more than 40% of Americans are being forced to retire, that is not clickbait. That is the flaw of what the data actually shows. The ceiling, depending on which survey you look at, climbs closer to 60%. And the people most likely to be pushed out are the people with the thinnest financial cushion to handle it. The honest truth is that for the majority of older Americans, the decision about when to leave work isn't really their decision at all. It gets made for them by their employer, by their body, or by someone in their family who suddenly needs them full time. The best thing you can do right now is stop planning as if you'll definitely get to choose your retirement date, and start planning as if you might not. Build the cushion, review your health insurance options carefully, and stress test your savings against an early exit you didn't see coming. The data is pretty clear on this point. Assuming you'll get those last 5 years of earnings is probably the single most dangerous assumption in American retirement planning. If this video helped you see the numbers more clearly, hit subscribe. We dig into the financial stories that actually affect your life, not the ones designed to sell you something. I'll see you in the next one.